Now we're going to continue with the strategic positioning to some factors that you might mention that are important as you position yourself relative to the competition. So one thing that's often mentioned is that we're the first to do this. And so that can be something that's really good, but it can also have some disadvantages. So I just want to kind of teach a little bit about the advantages and disadvantages of being a first mover. So I'll just click through here. So if you're the first one to do something or in a certain area, that can be really helpful because you can establish a brand name, an installed user base. There's not as much competition. You might be able to tie up key relationships with suppliers or customers. And if you have intellectual property, which we'll discuss later in the course, that you might be able to protect, you might actually get legal protection that will help you have an advantage over your competition. However, there's some disadvantages too. When you're the first one in an area, you have low efficiency, so you're doing it for the first time and you don't know what you're doing, so that's not very efficient. You can't learn from other people, so there's learning costs there. If you cannot protect your intellectual property, others can imitate you, and even if you can, sometimes they can work around the intellectual property laws. And if you're the first to do something, sometimes it's really hard to overcome inertia, and I'm going to explain that in a second. So if you're coming out with new features or benefits, you have to remember that people don't like to change, and so this is from a Harvard Business Review article about a 2x2 matrix showing behavior change and payoff. So obviously, if you have really high payoffs for the change and not much behavior change, that's a smash hit. And if it requires a lot of change and not very much payoff, that's a sure failure. But if the payoff is high but it requires a lot of behavior change, that's going to take a long time to work. Maybe not much payoff, but not much behavior change, that's going to be an easier sell. So the main idea here is that change is hard. And some people at Cornell won a Nobel Prize showing how we have these psychological biases and they are related to not wanting to change. So the loss aversion, meaning that the things we already have we think are more valuable than they really are. And status quo bias, we try not to change. We prefer to go with what we have. So that's important. So whenever you're creating a new innovation here, you're gaining something, but consumers are also losing something. So there's several examples of that. So you just have to be honest about things, because for every really interesting innovation, such as the Segway, seemed like it was so cool, consumers are losing something, and it can be difficult to make that change. Here's a great example. So this is one of the first typewriters, and it's called the QWERTY keyboard. And it's QWERTY because you can see at the top line, just as what we have in our keyboards on our phones and for our computers, it spells QWERTY at the top. So this was invented around 1860. It was given a patent in 1868. And why do we still have that? Is it because it's a first mover? Well, what's interesting is that another keyboard came out in the 1940s, which was patented in 1936. And if you may have some nerdy friends, or maybe one of you actually uses a Dvorak keyboard, I have two people that I know that use a Dvorak keyboard. It is simplified to work better with English words, to give equal load for both hands, and so it's faster. Why don't we have it? Why aren't we using it? Well, that's because our willingness to pay for something new like that is a function of perceived benefits. So maybe it's going to be more efficient, but also the cost, the switching costs. And in this case, when the Dvorak keyboard came out, there were actually people, and this is just recently, within the last generation, there were people called typists who actually would type for other people. So let's say there's an executive in a company, they would write out a note or a memo by hand and then give it to a typist. And then there were also other people that had typewriting manufacturers that would have all of these jigs and fixtures. And they already had all of this set up. They had their whole career based in the QWERTY keyboard, and they didn't want to have to learn something new, not just because they're lazy, but if you have to learn something new, the advantage that you've built up over a full career in knowing how to do the QWERTY keyboard is lost, and then new young people can come in and do just as good a job because they don't have the experience on the QWERTY keyboard. So that's what caused it to fail, and that's why we still have the QWERTY keyboard. However, second movers often win, so the case about the QWERTY keyboard is not necessarily the rule. And I won't give the whole story here, but basically there's two different ways of having color TVs. The first one came out and was doing really well, but later, due to standards and who owned the manufacturing alliance, the second mover actually won out as the standard. So just because you're a first mover doesn't mean that you can necessarily win. Okay, so I think we'll end there for right now.